Hello guys, good afternoon. Welcome to one more lunchtime listening. Hello. Good to see you all. Hello Adriana. On this Friday afternoon. Hello Maria. Tolkien is really interesting for you guys because he was really passionate about languages, and the thing that I think is the most interesting about Tolkien is that he wrote the languages before he wrote the books. He said the most important thing for him was the creation of the languages, that he then created the world around those languages. And we all study English, I study Portuguese, you might speak other languages, but something that's incredible is to see somebody create languages. That is something that really is amazing. And we can see throughout Tolkien's life the reasons why he became so passionate for languages that would eventually affect his creation of these wonderful books that he wrote. So let's start at the beginning, as I always like to do. Tolkien's name, we normally see it written, as you can see in this book that I have here that my son has. You can see here, it has his initials, J.R.R. Tolkien. The letters J.R.R. are his names, his first names. His name was John Ronald Revel Tolkien. And his family knew him as Ronald. So we normally refer to him as Tolkien. Most people say, have you read Tolkien's books? We use his surname, his last name, but his family called him Ronald. And Ronald was born on the 3rd of January 1892 in South Africa. Interestingly, that Tolkien spent the first 3 years of his life in South Africa, and this was because of his father's work. And at the age of 3, he would visit England with his mother and his younger brother. And unfortunately, whilst they were visiting England, his father would become ill and he would die, and Tolkien and his brother and his mother would stay in England. They would not return to South Africa. So let's see here a picture of Tolkien. He's the older child, and his brother. And we also have here his mother. And his mother's a very important person in Tolkien's life. Her name was Mabel. And Mabel was a widow. When a person loses their husband or their wife, they become a widow or a widower. So she was a widower, and she became the sole provider for her children. And she would move to a rural area in Worcestershire in England. And this rural area in Worcestershire would inspire Tolkien's imagination of what we will see in Middle-earth, in the places where the hobbits will live in his stories. So he would move with his mum and his brother to this rural area of England, and he would be homeschooled. Homeschooled was when you were taught at home by his mother. So Tolkien spent the first years of his life being homeschooled by his mother. She would encourage him to read. She would encourage him to study languages. She would encourage him to enjoy the nature around him. And this would also greatly impact Tolkien's love of these things when he was older. So he had a lot of admiration for his mother because of this impact she had on him. This idea of love of stories, languages, love of reading, and having this contact with nature. In 1900, his mother would convert to being a Catholic. This is a very important moment in Tolkien's life because we will see how important his faith was during his life. Tolkien was very famous for being very faithful Catholic, and even converted, eventually helped to convert his friend, who was also an author, C.S. Lewis, who created the Narnia collection. He would eventually be converted to being a Catholic because of his relationship with Tolkien. And Tolkien would be brought up a Catholic because of his mother. And his mother was originally a Baptist, and she converted to being a Catholic. And this was big news in 1900s because people were very much defined by their faith at this time. And she was kind of disconnected from her family, cut off from her family because of her choice of being a Catholic. Eventually, she would die in 1904 of diabetes, because we're talking of a time when there was no insulin. And this would mean that Tolkien eventually became an orphan at the age of only 12 years old. This would also greatly impact Tolkien's life. So Tolkien and his brother were made orphans once his mother died when he was 12 years old. And he would be taken into guardianship by a priest. His name was Father Francis. And Tolkien would go to school. Remember, he had been homeschooled by his mother. He would eventually go to various schools, and his fascination with languages would grow. He would study Latin and Anglo-Saxon and study these ancient languages. And a lot of the things that he created, the mythology side of his work, came from studying these languages and these ancient civilizations that used these languages, etc. In 1911, he formed a club with his school friends, which I think was amazing. I put it down here because I thought it was a nice name. It's called the Tea Club and the Bavarian Society. He had this club with his friends to talk about literature and other things. Very British to call it a tea club. And the same year he would visit Switzerland, where he would see the mountains of Switzerland. And this would inspire the Misty Mountains in his books. You will see lots of mountains in Tolkien's work. Tolkien would go to Oxford University and study language and literature. And he would meet his future wife. And somebody who's very important in Tolkien's life is his wife. So let's have a look at his wife here. His wife is Edith May Bratt. They were both orphans, and they met when he was young, and she was 3 years older than him. And the guardian, the priest who was looking after Tolkien, said he could not have a relationship with Edith. It was kind of the priest said, you are not to have contact with Edith. You're too young. You have to wait until you are 21 years old. So Tolkien waited until his 21st birthday. And on his 21st birthday, he wrote a letter to Edith and said, Edith, I am in love with you. I want to marry you. At this time, Edith was engaged to somebody else, but she would end that engagement and go and be with Ronald Tolkien, and they would get married. And it's a big sign of a big love story, because there were many moments when it could have not worked out, but they waited and they were deeply in love, and they would stay in love until the end of Tolkien's life. And before we look at his work, I want to have a look at this. I thought it was a really nice story to learn about, is how, I don't think I've saved it here, how when his wife died, I think I have a photo of his wife here when they're older. Here we go. Here we have Tolkien with his wife at their house. When Edith would die in 1971, and she was buried, and then he would die 2 years later, Tolkien. And their gravestone has the names of two of the biggest love story characters in Tolkien's work on the gravestones, which I think is lovely. This idea of their great love story continuing even after they had died. So the great love story of Tolkien was his wonderful wife, Edith. They would go on to have children, and his children would play a big part in publishing some of his work after he died too. So remember, I told you that he got married to Edith, And then shortly after he got married to Edith, he had to go to the front, the war front. The First World War started. So Tolkien had to go to France. He was heavily involved in the war. He went to the Battle of Somme. If you have ever studied the First World War, you know that the Battle of Somme is the biggest and bloodiest battle probably in history, and it was hugely impacted Tolkien and his perception of life with other people, the life and death situations, having this friendship with people on the front, and two of his close friends would be killed at the Somme. So it's interesting to study how that impacted. And Tolkien wrote about how the First World War impacted his perception of war, perception of his friends, and perception of people helping each other, etc., during this difficult time. And you can see a lot of this idea of sacrifice and being heroes in war, etc. You can see this in The Lord of the Rings especially. So after the war, he would start a job at Oxford English Dictionary. Can you believe that he worked on the dictionary that we use today? Tolkien worked with words that started with the letter W. And so he worked for at least a year and a half his first job was at the Oxford English Dictionary. And here he saw his passion for words continue, especially words that came from other languages that are adopted into the English language. Tolkien was very, very much interested in what we called Old English or Middle English, and this would really impact his perception of language. In 1919, he started teaching at Oxford University, and in 1925, he would write The Hobbit. The Hobbit is probably the easiest to read of his books, I think. I think you need to have courage to read Tolkien if you are a second language speaker, but you need to read it slowly because it's very, very heavily detailed. Tolkien's work has a lot of details. There are even maps, and you look at this map that he drew of Middle-earth, and the Hobbit is an incredible story because it's so complete. He created complete universes, where there were lots of mythical characters, but also huge details of where people were living, where they were moving to, what was happening. And I mean, it was a whole world. And as I said, he created the languages first. I mean, look at this language where we can see some of the symbols that were created reflecting the language that one of his languages that he created. And they were very much impacted by the languages that he spoke. Tolkien apparently had contact with almost 30 languages. He spoke at least 10 fluently, and he was able to read and understand almost 30 different languages. I mean, that's incredible. So you can see his passion for languages throughout his life. And as I said, he created the languages before he wrote his books. And so he wrote The Hobbit, and he became, after the Second World War, he became a professor of English language at Oxford, where he would stay until he retired. And that was when he wrote over a decade it took him to write Lord of the Rings. So you might be familiar with the Lord of the Rings because of the films, the Peter Jackson films that were in, I think, the middle of 2003 or 4 or 5. There were many films, I mean, the trilogy of Lord of the Rings, and they were huge successes, Peter Jackson's films, because they got over 11, I think, Oscars, etc. But I think what is interesting is that before that, Tolkien's work was very famous, and he became so iconic that he had to move away from where he was living and moved to the seaside in Bournemouth, where he stayed with his wife Edith because of the attention he received. Because after The Hobbit, people wanted more, and that's why he started writing Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings was so big that he had to separate it into 3 different books. And I'm sure if you've read Lord of the Rings, you know that. But it's an incredibly dense book, incredibly dense books, but they are so interesting and so detailed. He had also 4 children, and he would write, I think one of the, if you can't read his books at the moment, you could read a letter that he wrote as impersonating Father Christmas. This book here is letters from Father Christmas that he used to write, pretending to be Father Christmas to his children. And I think that's so magical, and they are so beautiful. And he'd draw and everything. So you can get these letters. You can find some of them online too. Another book that I think is easy to have contact with is this book that my son has, which is about a dog. And it's a story that Tolkien created because his son lost his toy dog at the beach. And Tolkien created a story about this dog wasn't lost. He had been changed into a dog by a wizard. And it's all kind of this story, and I think it's a great story to read. It's easy to read if you are starting to read Tolkien. It's a short read, and it's a lovely story for his children. And it's interesting to talk about his children because Tolkien wrote the first line of The Hobbit whilst he was telling stories to his children. He was correcting exams. One of the exams, the student hadn't written the answer. And so he wrote a phrase, and I wrote down the phrase here, "In a hole in the ground lived a hobbit." And that was the line that he wrote on this exam that a student hadn't written on. And it would be the first start of this idea of what hobbits were. And if you've never seen Lord of the Rings or read the books about the Hobbit, you can try and find them later, but you can see here, this is an example of a hobbit created in the Peter Jackson films. And it's magical, the way that Tolkien created these characters. And there is a lot of these types of mythical characters: elves, dwarves, humans, hobbits, dragons, orcs, ents, balrogs, trolls. They are all part of Tolkien's stories. And as I said, they became incredibly famous, and he was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature. He didn't win it, but he was nominated. And the impact that Tolkien had on English literature, because of this kind of incredible ability to create whole universes through his books, has impacted the English literature forever. You can visit the Tolkien Society's Instagram page and website. There's lots of information if you do like Tolkien. And I really suggest that you also try and read the books. The films are great, but the books are even better. But they obviously, as I said, require patience because they're very, very detailed. I remember even reading them as a teenager, I found them very dense. But there are so many themes in his work. There's good versus evil, death versus immortality, fate and freedom, free will, the corruptive nature of power. If you've watched Lord of the Rings, you know about the idea of the power of the ring, that the ring almost controls the person, changes the person. And as I said, as a devout Catholic, there are lots of Christian elements too. And he would continue to be a devout Catholic throughout his life. If you have watched the films by Peter Jackson, you know that lots of people go to New Zealand nowadays to see where the films were filmed, because there's even kind of like a Hobbit land there. I don't know if I saved a photo. Let me have a look here. Here we go. So there's kind of these little houses in New Zealand that were created where the films were filmed in New Zealand, and you can visit them. I mean, they're so cute, aren't they? I've never been there. When I was living in Australia and I went to New Zealand, I didn't go to this part to see the Hobbit area, but I wish I had, and I hope to be able to go there and visit them, because it would be really cool to see, I'm sure, this kind of place that was used to create this kind of idea of Middle Earth, which Tolkien so incredibly described in such detail in his book. And so for somebody who was so passionate about languages, you can look at Tolkien and appreciate somebody who lived and worked around languages his whole life. And I think that's an inspiration for us. Sometimes we feel frustrated that we aren't understanding, or we aren't progressing, or we feel like we are not being able to achieve the fluency level that we want as soon as possible. Whilst Tolkien took years and decades to create the worlds that he created, and study the languages that he studied, and create the languages that he studied. And I hope it serves as a lesson to all of us that things that are so complex and great, such as learning languages, take some time, but it's worth it. And Tolkien was very passionate about languages. And I am, as an English teacher, I think it's a remarkable lesson for us to learn this idea to have passion for learning languages, for learning new words, for discovering the reason why we have those words in the languages. As I said, he studied the meaning and the use of the words, and I think that's really interesting for us as language students too. I do this in Portuguese, I bet you guys do it in English, learning the reason behind why we have those words, why we use those words, why those words were adopted into the English language. So I hope you guys have enjoyed today's class. If you would like to study with me, there at the moment you can sign up to my course, my Dynamic English course, and have access to all of these classes too that are about culture. You can find out more details in my stories, and also the link in my page here on Instagram. So I hope to see you all in class. It would be wonderful to have you as my student and be able to continue this contact with culture and with this passion that I hopefully able to portray to you. A little bit of passion, a little bit of what Tolkien has, I try to have teaching you guys English. This idea of not just learning the language, but learning the meaning behind the words, the uses of the words, where the words come from, and the culture that's connected to them. So my task as your English teacher is to connect the language to the world of English. And Tolkien did that with his languages and the world that he created in Middle Earth. So I hope you've enjoyed today's class. For those of you who are my students, you know that the PDF of the activities that I will create based on this class to come here to study will be on the platform by Monday. I create a glossary, I create questions for you to do about today's class. So make sure you check it out if you are part of that course. And I hope to see you guys next Friday for another class. Next week, we have a class based on a band, a very, very important band in British history. A band that has been on my list for a while. The lead singer has his birthday on the 24th of July. So if you want to look up who will be which band we were talking about next Friday, you can try and find out through whose birthday it is next week, because that's when we will be talking about this very famous British band. But for now, I encourage you to pick up a Tolkien's book or watch one of the movies based on this amazing world that Tolkien created, and enjoy the passion that this man had for words, for language, and for creating worlds that make us travel to other places. I hope you guys have a lovely weekend, and I will see you all very soon. Take care now.